Okay, hi there. Welcome to a new growth and development video. We're going to take a few minutes to look at the challenges and the opportunities facing the emerging market economy of Mexico. Now, we've chosen Mexico because it's reached upper middle income status, has a per capita income in excess of $17,000 a year. It's an OECD country, but it's also a nation at risk of falling into the middle income trap, where an economy is unable to make, if you like, the next step to high-income advanced country status. It's a sizable economy. It's become a global manufacturing hub. It's one of the top 10 exporting nations in the world, but now facing up to severe competitive pressures from China, obviously, emerging Asia and African countries. And so their comparative advantage is under threat, particularly in manufacturing. It's also a country exposed to a number of other external shocks, particularly those persistent trade tensions with the United States. The IMF in 2019 came out with an absolutely classic line. They said that Mexico faces three structural challenges: corruption, informality and crime. Three fundamental barriers, if you like, to their growth and development. So here's our usual summary of over 20 relevant development indicators. By the way, of course, you can download a copy of this presentation. I'll put it in the comments section of the video. H-star ranking of 76th. As you'd expect, a relatively low level of working poverty given their per capita income is now above $17,000. Crucially for Mexico, the two things we're going to focus on in this video are a large level of inward foreign direct investment, averaging just under 3% of GDP each year, and also a high level of remittances. On some other sides, a couple of things I really want to focus on. One is that there is a significant gender gap in Mexico. Less than 2/3 of females have at least some secondary education. Again, this is in a country that's in part of the OECD. And the country only collects 13% of GDP for tax purposes. That's the lowest of any country that's part of the OECD. It's also lower than tax collection levels in most of Latin America. And that means there's little room for the Mexican government to have the money, the funds, to invest in infrastructure, health or education. Renewable energy consumption is also a very low, very small percentage of total final energy consumption, less than 10%. Unemployment in Mexico is very low. In fact, at the end of last year, 2018, average unemployment just 3.3%, the fourth lowest amongst the leading advanced countries in the world. Only the Czech Republic, Japan and Ireland had lower unemployment, and you can see that the rate of unemployment has come down substantially. Obviously rose during the last recession in 2008, 2009, but has come down, heading back towards 3%. It has been lower about 20 years ago. Inflation is now firmly under control. Mexico has had a history, particularly in the mid-80s and the mid-1990s, of very high rates of inflation, certainly well above 100%. They have an inflation target of 3%. The Mexican Central Bank has been lifting interest rates to help curb demand pull and cost push inflationary pressure, but inflation is now back down close towards its target level. As you can see, it's been significantly higher, particularly in the mid-80s and also again in the mid-1990s. But the growth rate of Mexico is the thing we're going to focus on in this video. Economic growth over the last 10 years or so, including a forecast for next year, 2020, economic growth in Mexico has been only just 2.5%. Now, once you factor in population growth, that of course means that per capita income growth is much slower, giving rise to the view that Mexico perhaps is slowing down just at the moment it needs to ramp up its growth rate to reach high income status. The middle income trap, by the way, is an important concept. We have a video on the middle income trap, and it exists for some countries that make big, significant progress in cutting extreme poverty and experiencing structural change and growth, but they then find it difficult, they find it tough to make that climb from being a middle income country to achieving high income fully developed status. What tends to happen is that growth rates slow down and a country can struggle to maintain their global competitiveness. Here's the growth story for Mexico. Some people are actually suggesting there could even be a recession in 2019, but certainly growth of less than 3% in recent years. And another way of looking at it is to look at Mexico's growth compared to other, if you like, emerging market middle income countries, some of whom, including South Korea, have made the leap. They've made the step up to being a high-income, fully developed country. So Mexican growth, if you take the figure from 1980 to 2016, their average growth is well below countries such as South Korea, Malaysia, Thailand, Turkey, and Chile. That is a major issue for the Mexican government. How can they lift their trend growth rate? Bit of the background, the peso is their currency, and crucially Mexico has a free floating exchange rate. It's had it for about 20 years. So if you get a question on floating exchange rates in the exam, use Mexico as a contextual example. It's a country committed to free trade in many ways. In fact, they've got more free trade agreements than any other country in the world. They've got free trade agreements with EU, with Japan. They're part of the Pacific Alliance formed by Chile, Colombia, Mexico and Peru. Mexico is, of course, committed to free trade and has just recently re-signed the Mexico-United States-Canada agreement. Corporation tax pretty high. They're in the top 50 for competitiveness, but look at that corruption perception ranking, 138th out of 180 countries. Relatively good on ease of doing business, although they dipped again in 2018. Crucial to understanding the Mexican economy, I think, is to be aware of the changing structure of their GDP. If we go back nearly 40 years now to 1980, oil accounted for nearly 40% of their national output. That has changed. So if we go to 2016, it's machinery and transport accounted for 60% of their GDP. In terms of their industrial output and things. So Mexico has made a significant structural change. It has been industrializing. If we look at their trade pattern, it's the 9th largest economy in the world in terms of exports and the 21st most economically complex. In other words, they have the capacity and the capabilities to produce a wide range of products. And the blue dominates here, suggesting that Mexico has become or has developed a comparative and a competitive advantage in things like assembling cars, video screens, telephones, computers, and other forms of manufacturing items. Oil accounts for less than 5% now of their exports. Beer, less than 1%, those who are fans of Mexican beer. Now, one of the key aspects of Mexican trade is that it is so highly dependent on the United States. Of course, it borders the United States, and gravity theory suggests that you trade more with countries in close proximity. Gravity theory would suggest that about a third of exports would go from Mexico to the United States. The actual figure is 72%, as shown by the chart on 76%, as shown on the chart on the right hand side for 2018. So as a result of close trade integration in North America with the United States and Canada, certainly the Mexican and US economies have become much more closely synchronized. This means that Mexico is exposed to shocks. I want to pick out 3 shocks for you. Clearly, protectionism is one of the big current issues. I'm sure you're following this. President Trump dislikes the fact that the United States has quite a sizable trade deficit with the rest of the world, but particularly with China and also with Mexico. Of course, there are hugely controversial issues about migration across borders. So the United States, of course, has threatened to impose tariffs on Mexico in the absence of measures to curb migration. Mexico is still exposed to the world oil market. Pemex, Mexico's biggest company, is the most heavily indebted company on the planet. Their debts alone amount for 9% of Mexican GDP. So what happens to Pemex will have a big impact on Mexican economic fortunes. And crucially, Mexico is a country highly exposed to natural disasters, earthquakes, droughts, floods, hurricanes, etc., particularly, of course, in the coastal areas. So Mexico, a country with a global manufacturing capacity, but exposed to trade tensions, the world economic cycle, and climate change. Just want to spend a couple of minutes looking at 2 particular aspects of Mexico that you might want to use in your exams. One is remittances. Classic exam question. Examine the importance of remittances to a country such as Mexico. Well, Mexico is the 3rd largest remittance recipient in the world. It's just overtaken the Philippines. I think there are over 270 million migrants in the world, and Mexico is the 2nd country in the world with more migrants. There were, for example, something like 12 million Mexicans, migrants, living and working in the United States, obviously sending money home. So the flow of remittances, over $35 billion in 2018, is strongly associated with the performance of the US economy. Interestingly, if the peso depreciates against the dollar, that increases the dollar value of remittances when they cash back into peso. And there's an entire industry at the moment involved in trying to improve the efficiency of mobile money transfers from the United States to Mexico to bring down the cost of remittance transfer. To give you a sense of context, remittances worth around 3% of Mexican GDP every year. Put that in another way, it's about $230 per person. The vast majority come from the United States, and you can see that Mexico is right up there in terms of remittances as a percentage of GDP. Another big aspect of Mexico worth understanding, worth knowing about, is FDI. It's a great example of a country to mention in an essay for context of a country that's achieved significant inflows of foreign direct investment. In fact, on average, over $28 billion a year, again, 3% of their GDP or 12% of total investment over the last 15 years. Partly because they're doing pretty well in terms of ease of doing business. A lot of the investment is concentrated on towns neighbouring the US border, a lot of assembly factories just the other side of the US border, and some household names have invested in Mexico, including IBM, Coca-Cola, Walmart and L'Oreal. Foreign direct investment into Mexico expanded from just 1% of GDP in 1990 to is then over 3% in 2016. So Mexico is a good example of a country that has become more integrated into the regional and global value chains, especially in the vehicle sector. So I think motor vehicles, cars, trucks, vans, etc. accounted for 2/3 of total investment. Now, some critics argue that much of this FDI has centred around just the assembly of manufactured products rather than FDI, which is a catalyst for increased research and development and innovation. So a lot of this investment coming in is essentially to build assembly capacity to re-export to the United States. Manufacturing accounts for nearly half of FDI. Of course, a lot of that will be in the car sector and other services. But there's a big debate about whether that FDI has been sufficiently transformative. Is it just simply building capacity to assemble, or is it investment which genuinely lifts the kind of level of research and innovation in the Mexican economy, which would then take it towards high income levels? Just want to take you, as we get towards the end of this presentation, towards a few good examples of barriers to growth and development in Mexico, things which are essentially holding the Mexico economy back a little bit in terms of their growth rate. One is that Mexico has a fairly low rating for research and development. This chart shows the Global Innovation Index score. Switzerland comes top, I think it always has to. United States is up there, Finland, South Korea, obviously UK doing pretty well. On the y-axis, and GDP per capita in 2016, real GDP per capita, PPP adjusted, on the x-axis. And you can see that Mexico is in the bottom left-hand quadrant there. China, for example, similar per capita income has a much higher global innovation score. So for Mexico to grow, they really need to ramp up their research and development and innovation capabilities. Financial sector is a barrier to growth, as it is in many countries that you'll study. The informal economy is huge in Mexico. Cash remains the dominant means of payment. Big part of the informal economy, of course, but it means the government gets less in tax revenue. There's limited competition in the banking sector. That increases the cost of loans for smaller businesses. And also there's evidence of fairly low financial literacy amongst millions of Mexicans, which obviously is a constraint as well. Notice, for example, that only 1/3 of adult Mexicans had a bank account in 2017. That's the chart on the left. Mexico down there with the Philippines and Peru, compared to countries like Poland and Thailand and China, where it's now above 80%. And less than 2% of adult Mexicans had insurance. Insurance penetration is the ratio of direct gross premiums to GDP. So, sorry, 2% of insurance premiums relative to GDP. Insurance is very limited. It's not pervasive and widespread in the Mexican economy. Mexico also has a fairly underdeveloped welfare system. So if you look on the left-hand side, these are the OECD countries. And in terms of social spending, be it pensions, healthcare, labour market assistance for the unemployed, Mexico comes bottom. Mexico comes bottom of this chart in terms of social assistance, less than 10% of GDP. In other countries like France and Finland and Denmark, of course, it's getting on to a third of GDP. So many people in Mexico rely on remittances, and they also rely on the informal economy for extra income. And also inequality is pretty high. The Gini coefficient in Mexico, again, these are the OECD countries, is amongst the highest amongst the OECD countries. To what extent does income inequality of that kind of scale act as a barrier to growth and development? Pisa stands for Program for International Student Assessment. And again, Mexico doesn't score particularly well in terms of top performance in maths, science and reading. According to the World Bank, the PISA rankings of 2015, I think the latest figures came out a few weeks ago, show that only half of 15-year-olds in Mexico have obtained the necessary skills to participate effectively and productively in society and in the labour market. And another really important aspect, a great example to put in your notes, is that labour market participation amongst women in Mexico is extremely low. It's one of the lowest of any country that wants to be an advanced economy. Only Turkey comes lower in terms of the OECD data. More than 1/3 of women in Mexico drop out of school and are not in jobs, education or training. Most Mexican women work in the informal economy. Childcare, maternity, paternity benefits remain well below peer levels in the OECD. That needs to be changed in Mexico to lift their growth rate. So what is Mexico doing to try to stimulate growth, to try and catalyse, if you like, the growth of the economy, which is stuck at around 2.5% per year? Well, lots of things they're trying to do. Investment in modernising infrastructure, particularly improving highways and expanding the train network. Urbanisation, of course, is a major challenge. If you get it right, it's a big boost to productivity and growth. If you get it wrong, it can create all sorts of problems of density in terms of crime and disease and low economic activity. So big need to increase investment in urban infrastructure and improve housing quality. Current policy objectives include promoting tourism. Mexico well placed for that, and expanding microcredit. The government's recently increased the minimum wage. Now that, in theory, lifts the disposable incomes of people involved in low value-added manufacturing assembly. Although, of course, that raises the question about unit labour costs compared to emerging Asia. They've also introduced on the farming side guaranteed minimum prices for small-scale farmers producing 5 select agricultural products in an attempt to lift farm incomes and address rural poverty. And we mentioned that renewable energy is less than 10% of energy consumption in Mexico. Well, they already have a carbon tax, but the Mexican government this year is planning to introduce a carbon emissions trading scheme to try and increase investment in clean energy. How can you use Mexico, finally, as context in your exams? I think this is a great country to use. Mexico has developed into a manufacturing hub, $17,000 per capita GDP. It's deeply integrated into the world economy. It's been part of the process of globalization. But key questions: is Mexico a country that will get stuck in the middle income trap? Are remittances of the scale we've seen, 3% of GDP, are they good or bad for Mexico in the long term? What are the causes for very low female labour market participation? What's the impact on growth? What can Mexico do to improve that? Is the very large informal economy a barrier to growth? Mexico has a free floating exchange rate, the peso. Evaluate the benefits and drawbacks of a floating exchange rate. Why is a low tax to GDP ratio of only 13% probably bad news for the Mexican economy? What can they do to address corruption, certainly perceived in the highest amongst developed countries? And crucially, is it good to be so dependent on one country? Last year, nearly 40% of FDI came from the United States, 75% of exports, and 94% of remittances. Is Mexico too dependent on the United States? Does it need to try and diversify the geographical pattern of its investment, its trade, and its remittance inflows? So much to look at with Mexico. It's one of those great countries I think could be a superb contextual example for your exams. Please do download this presentation. I'll provide a link in the comments section of the video, and look out for some more growth and development profiles in the weeks to come. Thank you.